Yo, what's good, everybody? My name is Cosmic, and I want to welcome you to my channel, Opinion Stated, where I give unfiltered, opinionated sports takes. Let's go. Yo, what's good, everybody? My name is Cosmic. I want to welcome you back to my channel, Opinion Stated. Today in this particular episode, I am going to triple down on my assertion, bigger than an opinion, and the fact that there were skilled basketball players in every single era throughout the history of the NBA, and that goes against Anthony Edwards' claim, of course, and that Sports Illustrated article a few weeks back that the only skilled player prior to present day NBA players was Michael Jordan. And we know that that's not true. And for those who do not know that that's true, I'm going to go through some data here today to present the case as to why you should be better informed, and certainly why the likes of Anthony Edwards should be better informed. But before we jump into today's content, if you haven't done so already, I'm going to give you a second to go ahead and click that like button and also to subscribe to the channel. I'm bringing back the hookah for this episode. Go ahead, I'll give you a moment. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, today's episode I am going to entitle the NBA's most skilled players of all time. The NBA's most skilled players of all time. Now, the criteria for this particular episode, I'm giving credit, obviously, where it's due to my unofficial sponsor for today's episode being statmuse.com. In the previous episode that I produced on the channel, it was a rather lengthy video. But what I did in that episode was I carefully detailed a few statistical, categories and data through statistical categories that would prove that there were skilled players across the eras of the NBA and throughout its history. So I think that it's very important. It's easy to use single game stats. So I did not want to use just a small sample size of a single season, because we know that if I ran down some tops in single seasons, some top 10 lists or some top 20, 25 lists, that would be a very exciting, episode, and the numbers will be crazy inflated because we do know that, players have had individual great seasons. So kind of bigger than that for me was the era, because as we begin to talk about era specific success and era specific statistics, I think that a 10-year sample size is that's a pretty hefty sample size. You'd have to agree. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to detail the absolute best of NBA in a few statistical categories. Once again, much like last video, we're going to touch on the total points scored in any 10-year stretch from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and up to present day. I wanted to touch on rebounders. I wanted to touch on the top 10 assist dishers. I want to touch on, because basketball is played on multiple sides of the ball, both sides. So I wanted to touch on also those who've had a significant defensive impact on basketball. So I want to talk about those who are in the top 10 for steals through the different eras in comparison, and also in block shots. And then with that, because I feel like those statistical categories, and the reason that I chose them for the last video was because I just felt like those, if taken into proper context, can give us a pretty good idea of those who could operate, or who, while operating proficiently in those categories, like that speaks to skill. It would have to speak to skill if you can do so in volume, right? So those are the categories that I want to focus on here. I'm also at the end. I want to take a look at true shooting percentage. And I was watching an episode of Gil's Arena, and I saw that Gil hates this idea. Like, what is this true shooting percentage? What is this shit? They're making up stuff. And like, all the categories are made up for the most part. But I think the true shooting percentage over field goal percentage specifically, over 3-point field goal percentage specifically, under just free throw shooting specifically, the true shooting percentage is all encompassing of all three. And it speaks to It actually speaks to the efficiency of a player as a scorer and their value to their team overall and the value to the actual game while they're on the court. I was watching an episode of Man Down Sports. Shout out to Man Down Sports here on YouTube, and the brother questioned, I'd ask anybody essentially, about this efficiency and why it's important. Why is a player's efficiency important? And I can give you an explanation as to why efficiency is important. Let's just say, for instance, as an example, I'm the guy on our team. You know what I mean? You guys are on this team. I'm the leader of this team. And, for the most part, I carry the team offensively. I carry the offensive load. I'm the man on this team, and you're not, the man or the woman on this team, which means you're just a role player, auxiliary player, etc., playing a role in support of me, the leader of the team. If I'm known to typically shoot very well, and this particular game, players have good games and not so good games, man, I go 0 for 15 in this game. The likelihood is if the team has been relying on me to win games and to do my part in large volume, man, me going 0 for 15 is not a good sign for the rest of our team. That is unless, of course, you who normally don't go or shoot 15 shots, all of a sudden tonight you have your greatest game. And you know what I mean? Like the other of our teammates help to compensate for us offensively where we have need, right? So without that, efficiency, my efficiency, personal efficiency, obviously would make a huge, huge, splash in terms of whether we win the game or whether we lose the game. So efficiency is very important. You know what I mean? If I'm getting 15 shots and I can knock down a significant amount of those 15 shots, then we have a good chance of winning. If you normally only get about 8 shots a game and you can hit 6 out of 8, that efficiency is really solid for our team, given the fact that you get an average of 8 shots and you knock down 6 out of the 8. You understand? So efficiency is very important. So wanted to get into these stats once again. The NBA's most skilled players of all time. And diving right into that, we're going to take a look at the first of our graphics here. The NBA's top 10 in total points list. Get a gander at that real quick. Again, this list encompasses the top 10. I just compiled a top 10 list of all of the highest total point scorers over 10-year decades, a span of 10 years. So again, I wanted to give us a decent sample size to understand that if a player can keep this up proficiently over a stretch, man, that would really, really speak to the amount of skill that they must have had as an offensive player. You'd have to agree. There's no way to disagree. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. But based on statistics and based on the history, based on the facts gathered from statmuse.com, these are your top 10 total point scores across any specific era, being the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. In the 60s, we saw the great Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt the Stilt, the record book, the almanac, one of the most dominant players to ever play the game, realistically. 27,098 points recorded in the 60s. Sits at the king of the hill, the king of the heap, with the most points ever scored in any 10-year stretch of time. Number 2 is Kareem in the 70s with 22,141 points. Number 3 on this list will be 90s version of Karl Malone, 21,370 points. Man, Karl Malone was an animal. Animal, in the 90s. If you guys are not familiar with the 90s, it was not just Michael Jordan by himself. Michael Jordan was just the best of the best of the absolute best at that. But Karl Malone and many others were no slouch. Coming in at number 4 on this list is the 2000s version of Kobe Bean Bryant with 21,065 points. I am so tired of the Kobe slander or the lack of respect for what Kobe brought to the game of basketball. Man, people had better put some respect on Kobe's name. And Kobe was definitely one of them ones. And I'll put Kobe up against anybody as one of them ones in the NBA. Coming in at number 5 on this list is 80s version of Alex English Alex English, 21,018 points total. You know, whenever I hear folks talk about the prolific scores throughout the history of the NBA, I not even almost never, I never hear people mention Alex English. And clearly, Alex English dominated the 80s with total points scored when you have the likes of Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, still in the league, Dominique Wilkins scoring at a pretty high clip, Jordan scoring at a super high clip. And yet Alex English dominates that decade of the 80s with 21,018 points. Shout out to Alex English. Put some respect on Alex's name as well. And number 6 on this list is Oscar Robertson, the great Oscar Robertson in the 60s with 20,261 points. Number 7, same era, Elgin Baylor, 19,983 points. And coming in at number 8 on this list in the 2010s is LeBron James with 19,550 points. Same era, coming in at number 9, the DMV legend, easy money sniper, Kevin Durant, coming in just a little over 100 points fewer with 19,445 total points. 2000s version of Allen Iverson finishes us out with this top 10 in total points list with 19,154 total points. Those are the top 10 across any decade total scores, any to dominate any 10-year period. That speaks to proficiency, that speaks to efficiency, and that also, Anthony Edwards, speaks to skill. Next up, we'll take a look at the top 10 points per game list. We see that in the 60s, dominating this list once again is Wilt the Stilt with 34.4 points per game as an average. Number 2 on this list is the 90s model of Michael Jordan with 30.8. Number 3 on the list from the 60s as well, the era of the 60s, Oscar Robertson had a whopping average of 29.7 points a game. In the 70s, number 4 on this list, representing that era of the 70s, is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with 28.6 points per game. Number 5, the Bean, once again, 2000s version of Kobe, 28.2 points per game. Coming in tied at number 6 on this top 10 points per game leaderboard would be Elgin Baylor and the great Allen Iverson. Bubba Chuck, 28.1 points per game, respectfully. Number 8 on this list, again, would be the great Kevin Durant, 28 points per game. Bob Pettit, number 9, with 27.6 points per game. And then a couple Laker greats, Bob Pettit and Jerry West, obviously represent that 60s era. But LeBron James representing the 2010s with 27.5 points per game throughout that stretch. Taking a look at the next list. Let's take a look at the top 10 rebounding leaders across the decades. Probably the most interesting thing about this list, as a matter of fact, I'll have you take a look at it for a second. Yo, they don't rebound like they used to. They don't rebound like they used to. These stats support the statement. This is bigger than my opinion. They don't rebound the basketball like they used to. This list will prove it. 60s. In the era of the 60s, we see Wilt the Stilt once again. Throughout this period of the 60s, he averaged himself 24.3 rebounds per game. The top 4 of this rebounding list all represent this era of the 60s. Look at how they rebounded the ball. Bill Russell, same era, 22.6 rebounds per game. Coming in at number 3 was Jerry Lucas with 19.2 rebounds per game. And Bob Pettit, same era, 16.7 rebounds per game. And these dudes were cleaning some glass, bro. These dudes were literally getting an exorbitant amount of rebounds. These brothers could clean the glass. They really could. Representing the 50s at number 5 on this list also will be Bob Pettit with 15.7 rebounds per game. So Bob stretched it across a 20-year period quite consistently, just a 1 rebound percentile difference Bob Pettit was one heck of a rebounder. Representing the 60s as well, Walt Bellamy with 15 rebounds per game. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar comes in at number 7, representing the 70s with 14.8. Dave Cowens in the 70s also with 14.6 rebounds per game. Elvin Hayes, from the 70s as well with 14.2 rebounds per game. And then closing out this list of top 10 rebounders in the history of the NBA based on the eras is Elgin Baylor with 13.8 rebounds per game. How can nobody have skill but Jordan? Jordan's not on this list. I don't see Jordan on this list. I don't know about you guys. So there had to be other players with skills and different skill sets, right? And clearly, this list of rebounders only stretches into the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. That means nobody from the 80s, nobody from the 90s, nobody. You understand what I'm saying here? So we need not be disrespectful as we talk about the game of basketball, because the game that we are enjoying presently seems like it's a shiny new thing, and we get this recency bias that statistics can help to dispel. Now, I'll say again, as I said it in the previous video, statistics can be telling, but statistics can also, without context, can also be misleading. So whenever I use stats or whenever I cite stats or hear a person citing stats, what I'm listening for is context. I need a little context with the stats, bro. You just can't tell me, oh, this person did this in 6 minutes. It's like he's the highest score in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. It's like, what does that really mean? You know what I'm saying? Like, give me a large sample size and give me some real context. You know what I mean? Some real context. So next list, we're going to take a look at the top 10 list, NBA's top 10 assists leaders across the decades. And number 1 on this list was the great John Stockton. The great John Stockton. John Stockton is so classically disrespected also as a floor general, as a tough defender. You know what I mean? His mid-range jump shot was, you better pull up on him. You could not just let him come off that little screen and roll. Will Karl Malone just shoot at his leisure? I bet you could not. And teams in the league understood that they could not. John Stockton was a really, really good basketball player, and clearly one that exercised a proficiency at dishing the rock to his teammates. And they weren't all just in the pick and roll. But 11.9 assists per game for John Stockton. Sitting at number 2, representing the 80s, the era of the 80s, is Magic Johnson with 11.2. Representing the era of the 60s, number 3 on this list, Oscar Robertson with 10.5 assists per game. Number 4, representing the 80s, the era of the 80s, was Isaiah Thomas with 9.8 assists per game. Representing the 2010s, Chris Paul, the point god as they classically refer to him, with 9.6 assists per game. And the 2000s version of this man here, Steve Nash jersey, who I'm representing today, I'm rocking today, 9.1 assists per game. Man, Steve was a really good player as well, really good basketball player. And the 90s version of Tim Hardaway, 9 assists per game, comes in at number 7 on this list. 2010's Russell Westbrook, 8.7, is at number 8. And number 9 on this list, representing the era of the 60s, is Guy Rodgers with 8.2 assists per game throughout a 10-year stretch, that 10-year decade of the 60s. Coming in tied at number 10 on this list of top 10 assist leaders across the decades, across the eras, is none other than Nate Tiny Archibald, and that 70s version of Nate Tiny Archibald, and the 2010s LeBron James with 7.6 assists per game. These are pretty decent numbers, but you can see, you know what I mean, there's fluctuation separation, huge separation between John Stockton at the top and then who comes in at number 10, just in terms of the amount of assists through a 10-year period. So to be able to keep that up consistently, come out and just, man, 10 years, over 800 games conceivably, if all 82 games are played. Man, that's a lot of assists. A lot of assists. Getting your teammates involved. Shout out to those gentlemen on that list. Next up, let's take a look at the NBA's top 10 steals list. Thieves of all thieves. Because like I said, basketball is played on more than just one side of the ball. Those who can score, that's cool. You know what I mean? But can you defend? So when I came up playing ball, You know, I don't want to be like this, man, back in my day. But seriously, like, it wasn't enough for me to score 30 on you. I'm not just going to score 30 on you and you're going to score 30 on me. That's not how it works. I'm going to score 30 on you and I'm going to shut you down. You're not going to score 30. That was my mission as I came out to play ball. So I don't care what I need to do to stop you from scoring, bro. I'm gonna lock you up. You know what I mean? So giving respect to the steals leaders, the thieves of all thieves across the eras, tied at number one, a three-way tie at number one through the 90s. Excuse me. You can see a sheer domination at the start of this particular list through the 90s. The top four thieves, or four of the five, are actually representing the 90s era. We have Michael Jordan, John Stockton, and Gary Payton with 2.3 steals per game on average across that 10-year decade stretch in the era of the 90s. At number four, tied at number four, would be Scottie Pippen, 90s version of Scottie Pippen, and 2000s version of Allen Iverson with 2.2 steals per game. Tied at number six, a four-way tie at number six, representing the era of the 70s, would be Rick Barry and Randy Smith. And representing the 2010s would be Chris Paul. Representing the 80s era of the 80s with 2.1 in that four-way tie would be Isaiah Thomas. So Isaiah Thomas, Chris Paul, Randy Smith, and Rick Barry, all tied at 6 on this top 10 list. And then rounding out the top 10 list of thieves would be one 80s era Magic Johnson with 2 steals per game. Let's take a look at the next list. Let's take a look at blocks. Let's take a look at the block leaders. Block party. Block party underway. Tied at number one. Tied at number one is the 70s era Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and 90s era Hakeem Olajuwon at 3.5 blocks per game. 3.5 blocks per game. 90s era David Robinson at number 3 on this list with 3.4 blocks per game. Oh, we had some big men representing the 90s, because at number 4 on this list will be one Patrick Ewing, 2.7 blocks per game. The 90s wouldn't let up, because at number 5 on this list is Shaquille O'Neal, the big diesel, with 2.6 blocks per game. Man, the middle, I won't just say the middle. I could say the middle. Could say the middle was anchored by a lot of really, really good centers. And I feel like that era of the centers is kind of where, the center position just kind of died out. You know what I mean? We had some giants, some behemoths in the middle, very skilled, space eaters. You know what I mean? Clearly, guys who could just, eliminate anything easy for you down there. They definitely made it intimidating. We're definitely good rim protectors. And Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, Shaquille O'Neal, but they weren't the only ones. You know what I mean? Like back in the 90s, there were a lot of really, really, really good defenders and a lot of really good shot blockers, like the Dikembe Mutombo. You know what I mean? Who's down on this list? I'm thinking of like Theo came in later. But guys like that. So there were a lot of really good shot blockers back then. Moving along to number 6 on this list, we got once again Elvin Hayes, representing the era of the 70s with 2.5 blocks per game. Number 7, 2010's version of Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis is a really good defender, man. 2.4 blocks per game. I don't think Anthony Davis gets enough credit. I said so in the last video, and I'll say so again here. Man, if Anthony's not getting more nods for Defensive Player of the Year, then you know what I mean? They need to take the voting from these folks in the media who actually are placing these votes, because, as I showed data from the last video, Anthony Davis has pretty much led, through the decade of the 2010s in block shots, and now through the first half of the 2020s, he's still leading in block shots. So why is a person so dominant not getting like serious nods for Defensive Player of the Year? I have no idea. I have no clue. But number 8 on this list, and closing out 8, 9, and 10 on this list are or would be players from the era of the 2000s, which would be Tim Duncan, number 8 with 2.3 blocks per game, Shaquille O'Neal at number 9 with 2.2 blocks per game, and Elton Brand at number 10, Elton Brand with 2.1 blocks per game. So that has been our steals, blocks, assist leaders, rebounding leaders, and point leaders across the eras of the NBA thus far, from inception to present date. From inception to present date. Now, I will mention that I'm only listing players or eras that have been completed. We're smack dab in the middle of the 2020s, so I cannot use those stats. I can't use that data because it's not relative to the data that we're using with a full 10-year, full decade completed sample size, if that makes sense. So I haven't, used any of the from 2019 season moving 2020 season moving forward to present day. Haven't used any of that data, any of those statistics, because that era is not complete yet. And so at some point in 5 years, if the channel's still around, I'll be forced to do a recap of that particular data, to include that particular data. So final statistic that I want to get into here is true shooting percentage, which we delved into in the last video. But in this one, for those who maybe are unfamiliar with the true shooting statistic or the metric, true shooting percentage is a basketball statistic that measures a player or team shooting efficiency, taking into account all types of shots and free throw performance. It's considered a more accurate measure of player shooting ability than field goal percentage, free throw percentage, or 3-point field goal percentage alone. Like I said, it's a metric that combines all three. True shooting percentage is calculated using the following formula: points scored, field goal attempts, and free throw attempts. A higher true shooting percent indicates a more efficient score, while a lower true shooting percent indicates a less efficient score. True shooting percentage helps compare players with different responsibilities and shooting responsibilities on the court. Let's talk about the NBA's true shooting percentage top 10 list. One other thing that I did not mention from this, it's generally known that at least a 60% true shooting percentage puts you in like elite status as a shooter scorer, as just a proficient shooter. And coming in at number one on this list should be no surprise to anybody over the completed decades that we have witnessed, that Kevin Durant, easy money sniper, sitting at the top of this list, the 2010s version of Kevin Durant with a 62.6% true shooting percentage. Tied at number two are the 80s era Adrian Dantley and the 90s era Reggie Miller. No shock for either of those. Adrian Dantley, I feel like, needs to have his praises sung a little bit more in the mainstream media as they're talking about shooters and folks who can get it done. I almost rarely hear Adrian Dantley's name mentioned as well. But 62.5% true shooting percentage for both Adrian Dantley and Reggie Miller. Coming at number four on this list is the 2010 era representative Steph Curry with a 62.4% true shooting percentage. Number five on this list, 90s version of, or representing the 90s era, John Stockton with a 61.4% true shooting percentage. Coming in at number six, the 2000s version of this man whose jersey I'm rocking once again, Steve Nash, tied at number six, actually. He and Kevin McHale, 80s era Kevin McHale at 61.2%. Tied at eight, both of these young men from the 80s, both teammates of the storied Laker franchise, one Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had 60.6% true shooting scoring percentages, or true shooting percentages. To round out this list of the top 10 true shooting percentage leaders across the decades would be the 2010s versions, or 2010s era representers, James Harden and LeBron James, respectively, coming in with a 60.9% true shooting percentage. Now, again, what would be the significance of pointing out true shooting percentage for me? Is just to, again, display that there are players who have skill. There's a league full of very skilled players, but some are significantly more skilled than others. And these lists speak to a proficiency of being able to do so through volume, right? So it's not just about getting up 30 shots a game. How efficient and effective are you at shooting, at such a high clip? So you'll get guys like, just through the history of the game, like I just mentioned two of my favorite scorers, in particular, which will be Michael Jordan. I'd love to see Mike lace him up at any point and get out there on the court because I knew he was going to give max effort, but I knew he was also going to chuck some. And so was Bubba. So was Allen Iverson. You know what I mean? Bubba chuck. So they were going to get him up. You know what I mean? But in order to make a true shooting, a true shooting percent, or to have one, as it stated, it's a metric that measures not just the points that you score, but also the field goal attempts and also the free throw attempts. So it's all, measured into one. These young men sit at the top 10 of the heap. What I wanted to go into really quickly is a final graphic. On this particular graphic, as I mentioned, not using the data from the 2020s, I just want to let you know how astronomical I wanted to point out and to give flowers and respect to how astronomical the true shooting percentages have been through the first five years of this 2020s era. And if this continues, man, look at this. We got Nikola Jokic sitting up here with 65.3. That is 65.3% true shooting percentage. Steph Curry, 63. Steph Curry and Joel Embiid actually sitting at 63%. And Domantas Sabonis and Giannis Antetokounmpo at 62.7. So these numbers actually represent higher numbers than the previous list that I showed. These numbers, these top five, they keep them up. You know what I mean? Like, these guys will literally sit atop the first five in this total top 10 list across the era. So we'll see, what happens and how that shapes out. That's, again, what I wanted to do with this episode. I really just wanted to make sure that I continue to impress upon those who may be naively in belief of some of the things that they hear from these imbeciles in the mainstream media. Just because you play proficiently Anthony Edwards does not mean that you are a historian. It does not mean that you know. Those who have not taken a look, not just at the stats, go back and take a look at some of these clips of these players who played. You know what I mean? Like, these guys are really good. They're full games on social media or right here on YouTube. If you're viewing this on YouTube, you can go back and watch some of these games. They're not in HD. You know what I mean? So the quality isn't that good, but you don't need crystal clear quality to understand of whether or not a player was athletic, proficiently great at any one thing or a number of different things in terms of the skill set that is required to be very, very good at basketball. That has been the basis of this video. I want to thank you guys for tuning in once again to Opinion Stated. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and make sure that you click that notification bell to be notified as to when my new episodes are uploaded. It's been a fun episode. I appreciate you guys for joining me. Until the next, blessings.